what we're talking about today is 5 or so things that the publishing industry, I think, at the moment, both editors and agents and commissioning editors are looking at when they look at manuscripts and ideas for China books, this big sector of China books. There's so many out there, there's so many being pushed in. What are they looking for at the moment? Well, I'd say the number one thing people are looking for at the moment is they like books to be thematic. They like books to take one edge of things. So the idea that you can just do a book about China and just take on everything and everyone in China, 100 subjects across 1.4 billion people isn't going to work anymore. The public's understanding now of China is much more nuanced and much more informed than it was 10 years ago, certainly 20 years ago. So people are looking for thematic books. Books that have done well recently are books on subjects like urbanization, which is something that people think they can get a grip on. We look at Chinese cities expanding and expanding, and we wonder, where is this going to end? We look at developments in our own cities in the West compared to China and wonder just how that's working. Environment is another big subject at the moment. Where is China going with its environment? Both, is China going to break the environment? Is it going to collapse the planet? But on the other hand, we know that lots of things are going on over there with solar and alternative energy and everything. Is there perhaps, interesting developments that are going to come out of there? Again, another subject that's been very popular is women. Now, we've had books about women in China before, but they tend to be, very good books, but they'll be about the migratory women who've gone to work in factories in southern China, or what is life like for agricultural women. We're now looking at much more thematic books that look at, what are women in cities doing? What are women in the middle class doing? What are women who are choosing a different life and staying single and not having children doing? So taking a quite narrow thematic and really looking at that in some detail is working, because people's knowledge of China is much greater, and so they want more depth, less breadth. I'd say another thing that people want at the moment is more of a bottom-up analysis of China rather than a top-down analysis of China. The last decade or so, we've seen a lot of top-down policy-driven analyses of China. Now, we're still going to all have to have policy about China, of course, but people are much more interested in what people are doing on the ground. So if you look at the thematics I talked about before, people are very much looking at, what is it like to be an urban dweller in China? What is your daily life like? How do things work? How does the property market work? How does public transport work? How does the employment market work? How do we deal with migrating workers into cities? The whole urbanization and the move from countryside to city. That's of great interest to people. Again, with women, what are women's daily lives like? So that bottom-up rather than top-down approach, what we used to call the sort of 3,000 feet view of China from the aeroplane. It's much more of a bottom-up thing. And I think that also is what people who are making policy now are looking for as well. They're trying to understand what drives Chinese people to do what Chinese people do and think what Chinese people think. The third thing I think that is very important to understand when pitching China books, and a lot of people are pitching China books and the agents and editors are looking for, is that the reading public now is a lot more nuanced on China, and people tend to forget that. They tend to think that the old days of China books being really just news from Mars, and it's just this place was so different. It didn't operate along any of the guidelines or rules that we would understand in other countries, just isn't true anymore. That people do have a great knowledge of China, the number of people who visited China and so on. So a much more nuanced approach is necessary. It interests me that not only is that true in terms of the sort of Chinese fiction that's now being translated, which is much more nuanced and deals with different parts of the country and different groups of people. In the old days, it used to just be books that had been banned or very best-selling books that were translated. Now it's a much wider array of stuff. But it's also true in something like the business market, where the idea that you can just do a book that's called doing business in China is probably past now. People are going to be looking at understanding in greater depth things like Chinese consumers, or understanding in greater depth how distribution and logistics works, or what's going on in the commodities market or the financial services market. Lots more case studies, lots more in-depth knowledge of how things are working. So more nuanced, and you can now assume the reader understands a little bit more than they might have done a decade ago. The fourth thing I'd raise is the notion that you can now write about, and people want to hear about, Chinese lives. We used to have a flood of memoirs of expatriates and foreigners who'd lived in China. These seem to not be, literally are just not really selling very much now. It feels like that's something that's been done It may have been interesting back in the days of books like Peter Hessler's Rivertown, when it really was pioneering, groundbreaking stuff. But now, you know, there's been so many expat memoirs, there's so many people there, and a lot of them are about places that are very familiar to people, so they're not quite as exotic as they used to be. At the same time, I think people have come to know Chinese people and Chinese society and modern China a lot better, and are more willing to try and understand Chinese lives. And that's how they want to understand China. They want to understand the Chineseness of the Chinese and how they express themselves. And we see this in any number of quite reflective memoirs that are about to come out from people from the Tiananmen generation or just before, which I think will be quite interesting and will shed light on how we got where we are and how society formed itself. So I think that's kind of interesting. It's going to be a while before we see the sort of sensational political memoir in China, but you know, the idea that there are people who have had experiences, whether it be business biographies that are a lot more honest, or whether it just be talking about, you know, how they formed themselves and have developed over the years, are going to be coming out, and those are very interesting. And the ability to interpret ordinary Chinese people's lives to a Western audience will be something that authors will be asked to do. I think lastly, the one thing that's very big at the moment and everyone talks about is this notion of just rapid response publishing. You know, China is always a fast-moving target. There are always big issues in the news that everyone wants to know about and needs a lot of background on, and waiting around a year and a half, 2 years or more for a book to come out on that subject just isn't the way things work anymore. We've already seen this happen when the artist Ai Weiwei got into some tax problems and political problems with the government. You know, publishers were very quick to get out extended interviews with Ai Weiwei, or his ability to communicate with the outside world, and publish those. Of course, ebooks allow us to do that very quickly, and short run printing allows us to do that very quickly. If you look again, Penguin very quickly got a book out by John Garneau, the China correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald, called The House of Bo, which really was about those events around the Bo Xilai, the Gu Kai Lai and Neil Hayward murder. And they were able to get that out with a lot of background, which was of a lot of interest to a lot of readers. I noticed the other day that someone has just very quickly published some works, some writing by North Korean defectors who've recently come out of the country. So we get that very quickly. We get their first impressions, and we know what happened up until very recently, rather than waiting a year or two for that. So the ability for people to get things done, written fast, and to get them edited fast, and to get them out there quickly, to provide people with instant background for what they're reading in their newspapers, is something that everyone wants to do at the moment, and get that done. And so I think that at the moment, talking with lots of agents and editors and commissioning editors at publishing houses around the world about what they want on China and what we think is selling on China, those are probably 5 broad things to think about.